Imagine this situation. You deliver several hundred ordinary domestic sheep to a small patch of land in the middle of an icy ocean. And then you simply sail away and don't think about them for a full 50 years. What would the result be? Mass death? Complete extinction? Ecological tragedy? Actually, it's completely different. The events on Campbell Island will totally change your understanding of how survival and evolutionary processes work. Campbell Island is located over 600 kilometres south of the New Zealand coast, roughly halfway to Antarctica. This subantarctic piece of land is characterised by endless winds, freezing rains, and temperatures that rarely exceed 5 degrees, even during summer months. There are no trees here at all, only low-growing shrub vegetation and surprisingly massive grasses. European seafarers who first discovered this island in the early 19th century found no land mammals there except fur seals along the shoreline. Bird inhabitants nested everywhere. Flora developed without the slightest threat from herbivorous creatures. The local ecosystem existed in absolute isolation for millions of years, forming a special natural balance that would soon be destroyed by human greed. In the closing years of the 19th century, the New Zealand government massively handed out licenses to use pastures on remote island territories. The concept was elementary. Lease uninhabited lands, bring sheep there, get wool, extract profit. Nobody thought about possible ecological consequences. Campbell Island seemed like an excellent choice because there was an abundance of vegetation and a complete absence of predatory animals. In 1896, farmer James Gordon, living in the city of Gisborne, decided to try his luck. He arranged to lease the entire island from government authorities, gathered 400 head of Merino sheep and their crosses, loaded them onto a ship along with building materials, and sent them across the stormy ocean to this god-forsaken patch of land. Gordon intended to build a sheep barn, hire shepherds, and organise regular wool exports to the mainland. The initial months looked promising. The animals fed on juicy giant grasses. Weather conditions were harsh, but the sheep managed to survive. Nevertheless, quite soon Gordon faced harsh reality. Transportation costs turned out to be astronomical, and the market value of wool began to fall rapidly. By 1900, Gordon went completely bankrupt and terminated the lease. Captain Tucker took his place, a more ambitious and less cautious businessman. Tucker came to the conclusion that the problem was insufficient scale of operation. He began bringing in sheep by the hundreds, one batch after another. By 1913, the herd on the island reached approximately 8,000 head. The herd numbers increased at an astonishing rate. Sheep multiplied in conditions of complete absence of wolves, feral dogs, and even foxes. The only threats remained frost, wind, and lack of food. Pasture lands began to degrade. Fragile megaherbs, which evolved without the presence of herbivorous mammals, couldn't cope with recovery after such intensive grazing. The megaherbs of Campbell Island are a genuine natural phenomenon. These plants have leaves the size of a large dinner plate and flowers that surpass tropical orchids in brightness. The giant Ross lily can reach a height of 1 metre, its golden inflorescences visible from a great distance. Pleurophyllum with huge glossy leaf plates forms real meadows resembling fantastic landscapes. Such plants developed these dimensions for the most efficient absorption of scarce solar radiation in conditions of continuous cloudiness and brief summer days. Their massive leaf plates work like solar panels, and dense pubescence provides protection from the freezing wind. However, for sheep accustomed to standard grass, such a diet turned out to be very far from optimal. By 1916, the lease rights were purchased by 2 businessmen from the Otago district. They established the Campbell Island Company and hired permanent shepherds and shearers who lived on the island throughout the entire year. Working conditions were extremely harsh. Workers lived in primitive huts, drafty from all directions, going months without fresh vegetables and fruits. Shepherds recalled that the wind on the island blows without stopping. It can continue for weeks without interruption, knocking people off their feet and forcing them to move on all fours. Precipitation falls 300 days a year, and fog can be so thick that you can get lost 10 meters from your own dwelling. Only the most desperate or the most despairing individuals could work in such circumstances. In 1927, the lease rights were acquired by a farmer named John Warren. This represented his final opportunity to get rich. Warren invested all his funds into this project, delivered an additional 5,000 sheep, restored buildings, and hired a new team of workers. For a brief period, it seemed that the enterprise would finally reach profitability. However, in 1929, the Great Depression struck. Prices for wool and mutton collapsed across the entire globe. What was worth £1 7 days ago now wasn't worth a shilling. Warren lost the ability to pay transportation costs, couldn't pay workers' wages, couldn't even provide himself with provisions. The island transformed from a source of wealth into a financial noose. In 1931, an unimaginable event occurred. The rescue ship that was supposed to evacuate the workers was delayed for a full 2 years. That's right, for 2 complete years. People were isolated on the island without means of communication, without food supplies, without the slightest hope of rescue. They survived on mutton and a few edible plants, simply trying to live until the moment of evacuation. When the ship finally arrived at the island shores, exhausted, hair-covered shepherds swore never to return to this cursed patch of land. Warren was absolutely ruined. The company officially ceased operations in 1934. Lease rights were cancelled, the island returned under government control. And what happened to the sheep? Approximately 4,000 animals were simply left to their fate. Picture a typical domestic sheep bred by centuries of selective work to exist on a farm. It's completely dependent on humans for everything, from winter feeding to summer shearing, from protection from predators to veterinary care. Now imagine 4,000 such creatures suddenly abandoned in one of the most inhospitable corners of the planet. The initial years turned out catastrophic. Sheep that weren't shorn for years grew wool to unimaginable sizes. Individual animals carried 20-30 kilograms of soaked, filthy wool on themselves. This wasn't protection, this was a real curse. Wet wool becomes heavier than stone, pulls downward, prevents movement, provokes skin infections and tissue necrosis. Sheep died by the hundreds. Some couldn't find sufficient food. Others fell from exhaustion under the mass of their own wool. Still others froze in wet fleeces during particularly cruel storms. Lambs born in spring often died within the first 24 hours of life, not adapted to the harsh reality of wild nature. Diseases mowed down the herd in whole groups. In the absence of veterinary care, any infection turned into a death sentence. Parasitic organisms brought from the mainland actively multiplied in the warm, moist wool. Foot rot spread with lightning speed. By the end of the 30s, the population size decreased, according to estimates, to 1,000 or even fewer. It seemed the story was coming to an end. One more decade, and the final sheep would die from lack of food or hypothermia. The narrative would end with another regrettable testimony to human recklessness and inhumane treatment of animals. However, nature prepared an unexpected surprise. Among thousands of doomed creatures, individual specimens were found whose genetic material turned out to be somewhat more suitable for existence in hellish conditions. Natural selection is not an elegant metaphor from a school biology textbook. It's a ruthless, blind, merciless machine that grinds up the unadapted and leaves only the most viable. On Campbell Island, this mechanism kicked into maximum power, and the consequences began to appear after just a few generations of animals. The first thing that underwent transformation was the wool coat. In individual sheep, an ancient, long-lost ability began to manifest: molting. Their wool began to fall off by itself, in clumps, during spring, like in wild rams. This was a regression to genes of distant ancestors that had been dormant in DNA for millennia. Sheep possessing the ability to shed excess wool survived, and their offspring inherited this trait. The second change concerned anatomical structure. The island's megaherbs reached the height of a human's waist. For effective feeding, it was necessary either to bend continuously or to have more extended limbs and neck. Nature settled on the second option. Generation after generation, sheep became taller. Their limbs lengthened, body structure transformed. By the 50s of the 20th century, the sheep of Campbell Island already differed substantially from their continental relatives. They had lean builds, long limbs, highly raised heads. Their muzzles became somewhat elongated. Jaw apparatus became more powerful, adapted to chewing tough megaherb stems. Even teeth underwent changes, becoming more resistant to wear. However, physical transformations weren't the only ones. Behavioural patterns also underwent evolution. Domestic sheep are ordinarily timid and defenceless. They panic upon discovering an unfamiliar object and rely on herd instinct. Campbell sheep transformed into cautious but not cowardly creatures. They developed the ability to keep distance but not turn to panicked flight. Reproduction transformed in an astonishing way. Standard sheep reach reproductive maturity at 6-9 months and can bring lambs already in the first year of existence. Campbell sheep began maturing later, after 12 months. This provided young animals additional time to strengthen their bodies before first pregnancy and increased offspring chances of survival. Even more amazing was the change in the birth process. Domestic sheep traditionally lie down for a lamb to be born. However, on the soaked, icy ground of the island, this meant death for the newborn. Campbell sheep began giving birth in vertical position. Lambs fell from a certain height, but at least they didn't plunge into an icy puddle and immediately ended up on their limbs. Newborn lambs also became different. They rose to their limbs within minutes after birth, not hours. They began suckling milk almost immediately, instinctively realizing that delay was deadly dangerous. Weak, slow offspring simply didn't survive until evening. Only the strongest, swiftest, most viable specimens survived. The population stabilized at a certain level. After the crash to critical indicators in the 30s and 40s, by the 50s the herd began growing again. Now these were absolutely not those helpless domestic sheep that were brought half a century ago. This was something new, a hybrid of domestic and wild, formed by chance and desperation. By the 60s, over 2,000 head were already grazing on the island. They lived in groups of 20-30 individuals, moved around the island along seasonal routes, gave wide berth to the most dangerous areas during storm periods. They formed their own culture of survival, transmitted from mother to offspring. Scientists from the mainland began receiving unusual reports from the few visitors to the island. Sailors who occasionally landed there for repair work or research told stories about strange sheep. Tall, lean, with dishevelled wool coats that stuck out in all directions. Sheep that didn't allow people to approach closer than 50 metres and ran away like wild deer. By the 70s, Campbell Island received the status of nature reserve. New Zealand government authorities initiated a programme to restore the original ecosystem. Megaherbs, which almost disappeared due to excessive grazing, began gradually recovering in protected areas. However, the sheep presented a serious dilemma. On one hand, these were invasive animals destructively affecting the unique flora of the subantarctic island. On the other hand, this was a unique population having colossal scientific interest. Campbell sheep transformed into a living laboratory of evolution, a demonstration of how rapidly a species can transform under environmental pressure. Biologists calculated that in 50 years, approximately 20 generations of sheep, transformations occurred that under standard conditions would have required millennia. This was accelerated evolution in real action. Genes that had been in recessive state for centuries suddenly came to the surface and spread through the population. A decision was made on a compromise option. The sheep needed to be eliminated to save the vegetation, but first it was necessary to preserve their genetic pool for scientific purposes. In 1975 and 76, an expedition was sent to the island. Their assignment was elementary on paper and extremely difficult in practice. Catch several sheep alive and transport them to the mainland. Imagine hunting wild animals in circumstances where a helicopter can crash due to wind at any second, where visibility rarely exceeds 100 meters, where every rock is slippery from moisture. Now imagine that your prey is sheep, weighing around 70 kilograms, that move faster than a human and orient themselves excellently in the terrain. The expedition used helicopters for reconnaissance, herding dogs for driving, and significant physical effort. The sheep demonstrated incredible skittishness and speed. They ran from people for distances of several kilometers, climbed rock formations where a human could only crawl. Individual animals made jumps from cliffs, preferring the risk of falling to capture. Over 2 seasons of work, they managed to catch 58 sheep. From these, 10 of the healthiest and most typical representatives of the population were scrupulously selected. 5 rams and 5 ewes that represented the genetic diversity of the herd. The rest had to be released or euthanized, because transporting such a quantity was unfeasible. The 10 selected sheep were fitted with temporary collars and literally manually transported through impassable areas to the shoreline. 2 kilometers of rocky terrain with an animal weighing 70 kilograms on your shoulders is not a walk. Individual specimens had to be tied up and transported by 4 people on improvised stretchers. On the mainland, the sheep were placed in a specialised research centre. They weren't immediately shorn, allowing scientists the opportunity to study the structure of the wool coat, its growth and natural shedding. Blood samples and tissues were taken. Genetic analysis was performed. Each animal was literally catalogued from nose to tail. When the sheep were finally subjected to shearing, under the filthy tangled wool, muscular, lean bodies were discovered, absolutely unlike the rounded forms of standard domestic sheep. These were athletes, formed by nature for survival. Leg musculature was developed like in mountain goats, chest cavity wide, bone structure strong. Breeding programs started. The goal was to preserve unique genes but not form a commercial breed. Campbell sheep were crossed only among themselves, scrupulously avoiding inbreeding due to the small number of founders. Each lamb was accounted for. Each mating was planned beforehand. Studies demonstrated amazing results. Campbell sheep had increased resistance to parasitic organisms that traditionally affect domestic sheep. They got sick with pneumonia less often, better tolerated dampness and cold temperatures. Their immune system was significantly stronger than standard breeds, probably the result of decades of selection without veterinary intervention. The meat of these sheep turned out tough and had an unusual taste, which was expected. They weren't raised for food consumption but for wool, and decades of existence on a meagre diet of tough grasses didn't contribute to marbling of meat. On the other hand, the wool, though coarse, had unique characteristics. It practically didn't absorb water and dried rapidly. On the island itself, meanwhile, the drama of the final act was unfolding. In 1970, a fence was built across the island, dividing it into northern and southern parts. All sheep in the north, approximately 1,300 head, were shot by professional hunters. About the same number were left in the south for monitoring. The southern herd continued to exist and reproduce for another decade and a half. Scientists observed how, Without competition for food resources, the population again grew to several thousand head. Megaherbs in the north began recovering, demonstrating how strongly the sheep impacted the ecosystem. Plants that hadn't seen sunlight for decades grew to giant dimensions. At the end of the 80s, it was the turn of the southern herd. The final several thousand sheep were systematically eliminated. Hunters worked for months combing through every ravine, every valley. The sheep by that time had become so feral and cautious that individual specimens had to be tracked for weeks. The final wild sheep of Campbell Island was shot in 1991. 105 years of this species' presence on the island ended. However, the story didn't end. On the mainland existed descendants of those 10 rescued animals, carriers of unique genetic heritage formed by chance and natural selection. By the beginning of the 2000s, the population of Campbell sheep in captivity increased to several dozen specimens. They were kept on private farms under the strictest control, like living museum exhibits. Breeders were proud of their unusual animals, displayed them at shows, told their incredible story. However, in 2017, tragedy struck. 5 rare sheep were stolen from protected territory and killed. The motives for the crime remained unclear. Possibly it was ordinary meat theft, possibly vandalism. For the population, this was a crushing blow. The genetic pool was already narrow, and the loss of 5 adult animals, including pregnant females, became a catastrophe. Currently in New Zealand, there exist only a few dozen purebred Campbell sheep. Their owners united in an association, exchange breeding material, try to avoid inbreeding. Each animal represents enormous value. Each lamb represents hope for preserving the unique line. Scientists continue research work. Modern methods of genomic sequencing allow seeing which specific genes transformed during those decades of isolation. Researchers discover mutations in genes responsible for thermoregulation, immunity, wool coat structure, metabolism. Each discovery adds details to the picture of rapid evolution. Genes of the immune system present special interest. Campbell sheep demonstrate variations in genes associated with innate immunity, protection from bacterial and viral infections. Probably these variants existed in the original population at low frequency and simply spread due to selection. Or possibly, these are new mutations that arose on the island. The story of Campbell sheep poses many questions to scientists. How rapidly can evolution proceed in extreme circumstances? Which genes are most plastic and easily transform? Can domestic animals return to wild state in several decades? And most essential, what does this story tell us about the nature of domestication? Domestication is often viewed as an irreversible process. It's believed that domestic animals are so transformed by artificial selection that they can't survive without humans. Campbell sheep demonstrated that this doesn't correspond to reality. Even a highly domesticated species retains genetic potential for returning to wild way of existence. This has practical significance for preserving rare breeds. Many traditional breeds of domestic animals are disappearing, displaced by modern commercial lines. However, in their genes may hide the most valuable information: adaptations to specific climatic conditions, disease resistance, ability to survive on poor feed. Campbell sheep also remind us of the ecological danger of invasive species. Even seemingly harmless domestic animals can inflict colossal damage on unique ecosystems. The island's megaherbs suffered so seriously that individual species still haven't fully recovered, decades after sheep removal. Currently, Campbell Island again belongs to wild nature. Megaherbs grow in huge fields, their flowering visible from space. Seabirds nest in the millions, covering slopes with a solid carpet. The island is included in the UNESCO World Heritage List as a unique example of subantarctic ecosystem. sometimes researchers visiting the island discover strange artifacts, old sheep bones with unusually extended limbs, clumps of wool of strange structure stuck in rock crevices. This is all that remains of an incredible evolutionary experiment that nobody planned, but which transformed our understanding of adaptation and survival. The fate of Campbell Island sheep is a narrative about ruthlessness and faith, about human recklessness and the amazing resilience of nature. It's testimony that life will find a way to exist, even in places where it seems absolutely impossible. And it's a warning that our actions carry consequences stretching across decades and centuries. These animals transformed from defenseless domestic creatures into hardy conquerors of harsh conditions, ready to battle one of the planet's toughest climates. They changed the structure of their bodies, the composition of their blood, their manner of behaviour and natural instincts. All these changes happen not over millions of years, but merely during the lifetime of 2 or 3 human generations. If this story impressed you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Share in the comments your opinion about this unintentional natural experiment. Could the sheep have evolved even further given more time? What other animal species are capable of such radical changes in harsh conditions? Write your thoughts. See you in the next video.